Seemingly, the only way was down for UEFA after they had staged the immaculate and perhaps greatest ever Euros 4 years prior in 1984. This was a gloomy time for the European game that lived in the day-to-day strife of hooliganism and still existed under the cloud of the Heysel disaster. Remaining within the confines of 8 teams, there was probably the fear that having 25% of the tournament's field polluted with teams from the British Isles might soil the good name the competition had recently developed. Could Euro 88 live up to the hype? West Germany had won the right to host the 1988 European Championships, but it wasn't without its opposition. The DFB's initial bid book had West Berlin's Olympiastadion wedged within it, not only as a stadium but one that would host the final. This, still in the 1980s as the Cold War still thawed out the globe, drew the ire of countries on UEFA's executive committee, predictably the Soviet Union, as well as Czechoslovakia and Bulgaria. With the threat that the Euros would have to make do without those from behind the Iron Curtain and within the Warsaw Pact, the DFB and UEFA relented. We left West Germany in a bit of a state after their 1984 group stage elimination in yesterday's video. Since Franz Beckenbauer had rescued the nation to a World Cup final ahead of the dazzling might of Brazil and France, and they ranked higher than some of the more exciting footballing nations of the time, such as Belgium, Denmark and the Soviet Union. Since Mexico, De Kaiser had reshaped his squad. Despite confessing that he didn't have the abilities to become a coach, Beckenbauer identified that West Germany needed to retool. The nation would be rejuvenated by talent such as marksman Jürgen Klinsmann, playmaker Olaf Thon, and Haas-nosed defender Jürgen Kohler. Despite this and the World Cup final that preceded it, national sentiment was grave. Little under 13,000 pitched up in Bremen to watch a warm-up friendly draw with Yugoslavia. Kicker described Beckenbauer as being on shaky legs with less than 100 hours before the tournament. Rejoining the fray of the European Championships after a tournament away and a hosting to forget were the Italians, who made a first successful qualification attempt since 1968 under Azeglio Vicini's lineup. Like Beckenbauer, like West Germany, the Azzurri determined a bit of a shake-up in advance of the championships. This was led by the brilliant defender Paolo Maldini, who joined Milan teammates in the backline, whilst Gianluca Vialli of Sampdoria fame led the line. He would be joined by clubmate Roberto Mancini despite his profligacy in front of goal for his country. Regardless, his partnership with Vialli at Sampdoria was enough to bank him a place on the plane. Italy made light work of Sweden, who had still yet to grace the championships ahead of their hosting in 1992, and Gothenburg's stunning performances in UEFA competitions across the decade. Portugal too, despite their heroics in 1984 and Porto's incredible work in winning the European Cup in 87. The Danish dynamite had lost some of its spark, losing the likes of Morten Olsen and Allan Simonsen. They were still populated by the effervescence of Michael Laudrup and Jesper Olsen, even if they were still recoiling from their 5-1 aberration in the 1986 World Cup to perpetual foes Spain. They didn't have to be at their best to get beyond Czechoslovakia and Wales, netting just 4 in qualification. Their nemesis Spain were involved in yet another tense final day of qualification to make the championships. Featuring alongside Romania, Austria and Albania, it was the former, their group mates from '84, who pushed them the closest. In shades of their prior qualification campaign when Spain needed to ramp up the goals, they managed just 5 this time at home to Albania. This meant they were still short by 2 of Romania's tally. Fortunately for Spain, Romania wouldn't repeat their heroics of '84 and floundered to a goalless draw against Austria. Their golden age was put on ice for the time being, and ultimately, the European Championships would only meet them too late down the line. Spain, however, had a great deal more confidence than they did in '84, and that was down to La Boutre, Emilio Butragueño. He, alongside his fellow vultures, were busy picking at the carcasses of La Liga year after year, and were expected to cause some damage in spite of their shortcomings in Europe. England had been revived too after a failure to qualify for Euro 1984. Bobby Robson had attempted to resign as England manager, and the Three Lions supporters were thankful that the FA stepped in when they did. Although they felt cheated by Diego Maradona and Argentina in the 1986 World Cup, they bowed out of the tournament at the appropriate time and could be proud of their efforts. Led by the Golden Boot winner in Mexico in Gary Lineker, Robson could also call upon his namesake Brian Robson, as well as John Barnes and Peter Beardsley as a fearsome foursome up front. Whilst English clubs were mired in the midst of the European ban after the Heysel disaster in 1985, they went into the tournament under some trepidation but quietly optimistic, even if the same couldn't be said about the behaviour of their supporters whilst in West Germany. Returning from the Cold War Soviet Union, as Valery Lobanovsky finally got some buy-in after his first failed stint as their manager. He'd won the Cup Winners' Cup yet again with Dynamo Kiev and had made inroads on the European Cup. The Ukrainian-born manager would rely heavily on the contingent from Ukraine, and this time didn't overwork his players. Like Denmark, they had dazzled the world at the 1986 World Cup and would have been a contender to win the tournament had they not been gazumped by an inferior side in the last 16. This was another chance, particularly after confidence was gained after the dumping out of holders France, as well as thwarting the East Germans' attempts at gaining access to the German party in the summer of '88. They'd be joined by the Netherlands, and the pair inextricably clung onto each other throughout the summer. Whereas the Soviets sailed through with a wave of momentum, the Dutch were lucky to be at the championships at all. The legendary manager of Rinus Michels had stewarded his country to the precipice of the tournament and thrashed Cyprus 8-0 in Amsterdam to confirm their position at the Games. However, there was just one snag in that particular plan. Dutch supporters had lobbed smoke bombs onto the pitch, and Cyprus goalkeeper Andreas Charitou passed out. Ordinarily, the match would be thrown out, the offenders would be given the walkover defeat, and qualification could move on to the next game. That next game pitted the Dutch away to Greece, who, with a Cypriot win by default, could still have qualified for the competition if they could beat the Netherlands in front of their own ravenous Greek crowd. Instead, UEFA spinelessly ordered a rematch. The Dutch won by 4 goals at a canter, and a furious Greece were out of the competition before they could welcome the Netherlands into their own backyard. The 8th and final qualifier would be a debutante, meaning that Belgium missed out in a tight Group 7 of qualification. 2 points separated the top 4 in a 5-team group as Jack Charlton's Republic of Ireland forged ahead of neighbours Scotland, as well as a stringent Bulgarian team who had made up the knockout phase of the prior World Cup. Ireland could thank their nearest and dearest immensely for their participation in the tournament after Scotland performed them as solid in Sofia. Bulgaria needed just a point from their final home game to stake their place in West Germany, but they didn't countenance Gary Mackay popping up with a winner to eliminate them and sending the Irish through for a lovely spot of Celtic aid. Ireland were a breath of fresh air. Under the World Cup winner Charlton, they would play the traditional British football of its day, which involved a directness and an air of lumping it up to the big man. But in this era of getting it launched, Ireland mixed that philosophy with a ferocity in the press, terrifying their opponents and making them an absolute nightmare to play against. Despite their reputation of being win or lose, hit the booze, Ireland were by no means heading to West Germany to make up the numbers. They had several class players, could cause problems for any team. Nonetheless, the small format of 8 teams straight into the semi-finals was expected to be prohibitive at a first ever championships for the boys in green. Group A began in earnest with the host pitted against Italy, and for one man a slice of retribution to the baying blood of the masses. Roberto Mancini had been castigated throughout the first dozen or so internationals he had featured in. The question was, could he only perform within a club environment at Sampdoria? He answered those critics, bagging the first goal of the tournament in Dusseldorf and roared off in a Marco Tardelli manner in a celebration filled with anger. His heroism would have lasted only 3 minutes for his inaction that led to West Germany's leveller, but for the goal to be overshadowed by the harshness from English referee Keith Hackett. Italian goalkeeper Walter Zenga was adjudged to have held onto the ball for too long and, in a rare case of a referee penalising a goalkeeper for such an offence, West Germany were gifted an indirect free kick. A featherweight touch from Pierre Littbarski to future Inter Milan hero Andy Bremer was converted into a goal through the flimsy defensive wall of Roberto's Donadoni and Mancini. West Germany couldn't capitalise on a nervy opening night. No control was gleaned from the contest whatsoever, and Italy was simply happy to take the point even if they had led a lacklustre host at one point, even if it was brief. Elsewhere in Group A, naturally, Spain and Denmark were pitted against one another. After the penalty defeat in the 1984 semi-final and the complete evisceration in 1986 World Cup, Denmark were out for revenge. Unfortunately, Sepp Piontek couldn't count on his heroes of the past, nor could he count on Frank Arnesen, who was ruled out of the tournament through injury. This left Preben Elkjær out of position for the most part, and he was ruled ineffective throughout Denmark's time across the border in West Germany. The prophecies that Spain would be much improved from their run to the final, albeit with little quality, was proven against Denmark, even if their opponents were much weaker than they had been in 1984 and 86. Michel, one of the aforementioned vultures that were busy driving La Roja, ran the game and netted the early goal, from which Spain formed the foundation of their opening day triumph. In shades more of 1984 than 1986, Denmark showed some fight, equalising through Michael Laudrup, and could count a shoulder injury to Jose Antonio Camacho as fortunate to their cause. This Spanish team, however, were far more resilient than they had been throughout the rest of the 80s. Fortune turned to the Spaniards as Emilio Butragueño dredged his team back in front despite standing a yard offside in the build-up to his goal. Spain ultimately sealed the victory in deserving fashion when Rafael Gordillo, robbed of a place in the 1984 final, clipped a third goal in off the bar. Despite gloss applied to the result by a late Danish consolation, it was clear that the Dynamites had fizzled out of their game. This was in spite of making some important changes. With one hand, Sepp Piontek deservingly handed a start to Peter Schmeichel in goal. With the other, he erroneously placed 38-year-old Morten Olsen into the heart of midfield, despite his legs being gone and him being more use as a sweeper. As soon as Preben Elkjær's Achilles gave way and he departed not only Euro 88 but his international career, Denmark's chances were gone. Their performance against West Germany paled into comparison to the heady days of Mexico 86 when they had swatted their opponents aside 2-0 in the group stage. This time, their hosts were the ones doing the swatting when Jurgen Klinsmann and Olaf Thon, two of Beckenbauer's new boys, netted either side of the break to confirm Denmark's early flight home with a game to spare. The true important contest came in the other matchday 2 tie between Italy and Spain, which was quickly rebadged as winner stays on. The nerves were in place as neither side created too many opportunities. However, with a forward as talented and as prolific as Sampdoria's Gianluca Vialli, he didn't need many sniffs at goal to get the decisive late winner, which all but confirmed Italy and West Germany's spots in the knockouts. Soren Lerby remarked that the good years of Danish football were over as his international career limped a goodbye against Italy. Denmark were porous, but the Azzurri couldn't capitalise until the second half when they made their opponents pay through goals thanks to Alessandro Altobelli and Luigi Di Agostini. Sepp Piontek wouldn't be too far behind his heroes in calling the Danish national team quits after their loss in Bucharest cost them a place at Italia 90. Italy wouldn't be as fortunate as Portugal had been in 1984 when they had topped their group thanks to West Germany's malpractice against Spain. On home soil, the Germans made it count thanks largely to Rudi Völler, the West German equivalent to Roberto Mancini. Like Mancini, Völler had gone through a piece of turbulent goal scoring for his nation in the build-up to Euro 88, failing to score for almost a full year. He'd put in yet another stinker of a performance without a goal against Denmark, but Beckenbauer still backed him. For many, he had already blown his last chance, but if he continued in his profligacy, surely even Beckenbauer would have had to cull his time in the starting 11 as well. Thankfully, both Voller and Beckenbauer encountered a sluggish Spain, who reverted to the form of '84 with a tiresome performance. Voller finally ended his duck by netting not just one but 2 goals to sink the Spaniards a little goal machine, and thanks to goal difference they had trumped Italy to top spot. He could thank Lothar Matthäus for an all-too-rare majestic performance when it really mattered at the heart of the West German midfield. After an imperious group stage, the host nation were now equipped with the belief that they could win the whole thing. They were certainly deserving winners of Group A. The only thing that could stop them now was a nightmarish foe in the other group. Here for the beer might have been the unofficial slogan of the Irish national team heading into the summer of '88, but almost instantly they revealed that they were more than that little pithy ditty. Either way, the Green were out in full force as 20,000 made the schlep to West Germany for the tournament. They had the sweetest celebration first up, not only a match against the English, but a win over the English. In what was the first step to becoming the nation's pariah for that summer, Tony Adams was outjumped by John Aldridge, who dwarfed him considerably. Fortunately for Ireland, not in the air, as the English-born centre-forward nodded it down to the Scottish-born Ray Horton. He too leapt like the proverbial salmon to blast a header beyond Peter Shilton. Ireland had done it. Jack Charlton couldn't celebrate too much, not because he was English and a former World Cup winner with England, but because in jumping up to greet the header, he performed a header of his own, cracking the underside of the dugout in celebration. England were wasteful, with Peter Beardsley being the main culprit and Gary Lineker was massively off colour. We didn't know it at the time, but he would never be able to replicate his exploits from Mexico in '86 after contracting hepatitis in the run-up to the championships. It's remarkable that he even featured at all. Not that Ireland could give a fuck, they'd beaten England, and deservingly so. Now, they probably just needed one more point to get into the semi-finals of a European Championship. So whilst Ireland were in dreamland, England were all but in the departure lounge, despite laughably being second favourites to win the thing before kick-off. The group continued to be turned on its head when the aggressively formidable and organised Soviet Union dispatched of the Dutch. This should have been expected after their beautiful football at Mexico '86, a tournament where the likes of Marco van Basten, Frank Rijkaard and Ruud Gullit merely had a watching brief. In pipping the Dutch to a slender 1-0 win, Lobanovsky did move away from some of his beliefs after the all-out attacks of '86 resulted in an undeserved last 16 exit. A shrewder performance in Cologne, capped off by Vasil Rat's second-half winner, was the perfect start to the tournament. Marco van Basten, only deployed from the hour mark after the Soviets had struck the only goal of the game, had been dogged by injury for the majority of his young career. So much so that he had contemplated retirement in 1987, less than a year out from the tournament. After almost leaving the camp in dismay, Mikkels reeled him back into the fold, starting him against England 5 days later in Dusseldorf. In the baking heat of the northwest of West Germany, Van Basten repaid his manager's belated confidence in his abilities with one of the Dutchman's more complete performances that his already illustrious career could boast. He stuck 3 goals beyond an improved England, who did rally via Brian Robson's equaliser but ultimately was second best. In a contest where a victory was imperative, England had confirmed their exit before meeting the great Soviets, whilst the Dutch had survived one elimination playoff and swapped it out for another against the Irish on matchday 3. In a surprise to absolutely everybody who had taken in the sport of football over the 1980s, Ireland dominated the Soviet Union with and without the ball. Ireland's dream sequence looked to continue in Hanover as Jack Charlton rigged his team to the precipice of a spot in the semi-finals. Against the frazzled Soviets, however, Ireland resorted to Irish means for the opening goal. A long throw into the box from Mick McCarthy caused havoc with the Soviet defence, and the scruffy ordeal was completed typically with a shinned effort from Ronnie Whelan. It hit the net, Ireland led at half-time, and nobody in green cared about the means. But at some point in any dream, you've got to wake up. Ireland were denied a penalty and a probable man advantage, and the Soviet Union capitalised on this misfortune when Oleg Protasov levelled up proceedings against a run of play 15 minutes from time. Ireland had gone from an almost certain semi-final position to needing a result against the Dutch on the final day. Still, a win and a draw against two dangerous sides in their first European Championship, the Irish party continued on to Gelsenkirchen. Meanwhile, the Soviets were posted out to Frankfurt for their final group game against the diminished English, needing a point to be absolutely sure. Given England's fragility and their players' minds already on the beach for a truncated holiday, the Soviets were never going to pass up an opportunity to rub further salt into their wounds. England softly gave up an early goal, just as they had done in their previous games. Despite their wretched performances, Glenn Hoddle and Tony Adams converged to give England something, an equaliser that was wholly undeserved and quickly forgotten when the Soviets rifled into higher gears than their opponents just could not reach. They shipped another 3 goals in defeat as Alexei Mikhailichenko and sub Viktor Pasulko found the net to complete a miserable summer for the Three Lions. When that third and final goal went in, Soviet Union's place as group winners was all but confirmed. Joining them at that stage in the semi-finals was all set to be the plucky Irish, whose fairy tale of West Germany continued. They could have been ahead as well had Paul McGrath's header clattered off the inside of the post at a more opportune angle. John Aldridge couldn't get anything onto the rebound and the Dutch lived to fight another day. As the clock ticked on and the Soviets led comfortably, Ireland held firm, until a goal from nowhere. Ronald Koeman smashed an ungainly effort into the turf which spiralled into the path of Wim Kieft. The man affectionately known by Marco van Basten as a big tree nodded in on the far post and branched the Dutch out into the semi-finals. As it turned out, it would be Ireland's happiest European Championship summer at their first attempt, and for England it ranks amongst their worst. For the Soviet Union and the Netherlands, they were contenders in what was shaping up to be a very even 4 nations in the semi-finals. Franz Beckenbauer publicly announced that he would have rather have faced the Irish than the Dutch in the Hamburg semi-final. Many saw this as a dig at Ireland and their lesser quality players, but maybe Beckenbauer was actually referring to the masses of Dutch supporters that marched on the northern city of Hamburg that was closest to the Netherlands geographically. Officially, only 15,000 Dutch supporters were in the Volkspark Stadion, but in reality it's likely that more than half of the 56,000 capacity were of a Dutch persuasion. Quite what the DFB were thinking using Hamburg as a venue with a potential semi-final against the nearby Netherlands is anybody's guess. Maybe this was the Uno reverse to the West German triumph over Belgium in Antwerp in 1972. As neutral ground as any host has suffered before and probably since, the semi-final was sprinkled with even more tension than what was agreeable. Pierre Littbarski had been named as a starting player, initially only for Beckenbauer to change his mind after team sheets had been distributed. Littbarski was then placed into the unenviable position of faking a stomach bug to protect the manager's belated decision. In his place was Frank Mill, who quipped it would have been nice to have played the match in Germany, and so another European Championship classic ensued. This being West Germany in the knockouts of a tournament, you just know there was a penalty involved. The hosts won what appeared to be a soft decision when Jurgen Klinsmann performed a typical tumble in the box. More than a few Dutch supporters had flashbacks to 1974 when Bernd Holzenbein took a similar dive to get the World Cup final back on track against the same opposition. Fortunately for the referee, Frank Rijkaard had made contact with Klinsmann. Lothar Matthäus did well for someone who was said to have had an inability to rise to the big occasions when he slammed in a penalty, even if the Dutch goalkeeper did get significant hands to it. The dodgiest penalty of the lot, however, was awarded to the Dutch 15 minutes from time. Converting with consummate ease as ever, Ronald Koeman levelled the scores up with barely any time left on the clock. Beckenbauer then had to delve into the bench and retrieve Littbarski, who had been embarrassed by his removal from the team sheet. The plan had been to save the forward for extra time, but he couldn't take too long to make an impact. A wickedly delivered corner bamboozled the Dutch and required a goal line clearance. In the end, Littbarski wasn't needed for extra time because the match was long over by that time. And it's because Marco van Basten fulfilled yet more promise to Rinus Michels with the heroic winner 2 minutes from time. A whole nation celebrated they had taken revenge not only for 1974 but for more nefarious reasons, as Ronald Koeman wiped his arse on the swapped West German shirt, as Rinus Mikkel's interview where he declared an extra feeling of satisfaction attested to, as celebrations the volume of which in the Netherlands hadn't been seen since Liberation Day in 1945 also attested to. The Dutch had conquered the Germans with more than a whiff of non-footballing sentiment about their revenge. Whilst Franz Beckenbauer called the defeat their most unfortunate in decades and Jurgen Klinsmann defended their performance by labelling it their best game in the tournament, the West German media didn't toe the line. Der Spiegel lamented that the squad hadn't improved in the 4 years in which Beckenbauer had held the post, much like the resentment that followed Enzo Berzot and Italy in 1980, as well as Michel Hidalgo and France through a poor 1970s, all would be forgiven eventually. Like Berzot, Beckenbauer would recoil from this so-called underperformance by winning the World Cup in 2 years' time. Waiting for the Dutch in the final would either be Italy or the Soviet Union, both of which, like the Dutch, rallied against their tradition in an attempt to lift the Henri Delaunay trophy. Italy were normally built upon an aged team with a sturdy backline. Throughout the tournament though, they had boasted starting 11s averaging as low as 24 years of age with a propensity to attack. The Soviet Union meanwhile had become an attacking behemoth once again under Valery Lobanovsky and his largely Dynamo Kiev unit. He too, however, strayed away from his beliefs by making his Soviet vintage of '88 a little bit harder to beat. Within moments of the semi-final, personal tragedy struck for Oleg Kuznetsov when he smashed into Gianluca Vialli. Whilst the yellow card was deserved, his second of such colour in a 5-game tournament, that being punishment enough to miss a once-in-a-lifetime final, less deserved. The game was a tense affair, like any other semi-final, which went into the half-time break goalless and was decided in the second period. Unlike the other match, partially decided by penalties, the outcome of this contest could be partially blamed on the inclement West German weather. The heavier conditions in Stuttgart suited the Soviets as the match progressed. The Italians' lighter and more technical football was shown to be a little too one-dimensional when compared to the powerful Soviets. Whilst Lobanovsky's side could play pretty and could be technical, they were also domineering in the same way that Italy weren't. So when the pristine sun-drenched pitch gave way for more of a bog, the Soviets pounced, and through Gennady Litovchenko and Oleg Protasov, they found their goals in a deserving 2-0 win. Even though they should have been defeated by more, this was a necessary step for the Italians in a recovery after their shortfall since winning the World Cup in 1982. They'd be much better and much stronger for the lesson that they had been taught by the experienced Soviets, and just in time for hosting their own World Cup 2 years later. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, on their £19 per day pocket money, treated themselves to some shopping in Stuttgart to celebrate. Their biggest match since the first European Championship final of 28 years previous was next. For the Dutch, it was their biggest game in a generation and the perfect chance to win their first piece of silverware as a footballing country. For all their experience, might and previous against the Dutch, at this very tournament, Valery Lobanovsky and the entire Soviet Union would have been enraged at the nature of their first concession. From the second ball at a set piece, Erwin Koeman looped a hopeful ball into the box that found Marco van Basten in utter acres of room. Instead of heading towards goal or, attempting a ludicrous volley from a tight angle, he guided a header back across the goal mouth to the awaiting Ruud Gullit. No words could do the justice to how impactful this header was. This was a prime Gullit, with the weight of the Netherlands behind him flinging the full force of his physical body and the full spirituality of the Dutch population into the ball. It produced a goal as powerful as you're likely to see for roughly 30 minutes. In between one fantastic goal and the fantastic goal of the championships, the Soviets ought to have levelled. Igor Belanov, Ballon d'Or winner less than 2 years prior, blazed a shot over when it was easier to miss. He and his country were punished by a piece of genius after the break that should go down as the greatest goal ever scored in a final. Marco van Basten found himself in roughly the same position as he had done to set up his country's first goal. With less players polluting the penalty area this time, however, the fatigued Van Basten decided to let rip with a desperation that he might not have done had he been fully fit, and we should all be grateful that he did so, because when the long pass looped onto his stride, he volleyed back across from where it came from, creating an instantly legendary goal. History neglects to recall much after that special goal, but the Soviet Union were not out of it. Igor Belanov found himself with an even more glorious opportunity to dredge his nation back into the game, this time from the penalty spot. After more than 2 minutes of delays and opposition goading, Belanov wilted, striking a dodgy penalty against the goalkeeper. It was the Soviet Union's last meaningful action not only of this European Championships, but of any European Championships. They would cease to exist by the time the next edition was hosted in Sweden 4 years later. Meanwhile, the Dutch recoiled from a pathetic decade with their greatest glory yet, and the potential, thanks to the Milan trio of Van Basten, Gullit and Rijkaard, to become a force. They'd all complete the club game in Italy, and Van Basten had scarily yet to enter his peak. To celebrate, a motorway bridge on the Dutch-German border was spray-painted "Und jetzt fahren sie in das Land des Europameister," which I hope is intelligible enough German that translates to "You are now driving into the land of the European champions." And it wouldn't get much better for the Dutch. It didn't live up to the heights of Michel Platini, Le Carré Magique, Danish Dynamite and the 1984 Euros, but its sequel in West Germany had its own identity and its own quality. It was the Terminator 2 to the 1984 tournament's Terminator, I guess. Probably didn't quite reach the absolute heights, but still serviceable nonetheless. There were brilliant sequences from teams such as the Soviet Union and Ireland who surprised, as well as the usual suspects of the hosts and their nemesis, Netherlands. It will be the only football tournament primarily remembered for one goal, thanks to the genius of Marco van Basten. The question now was, could the next Euros live up to such acts of greatness? After all, football was reaching a turning point at Italia 90, and the sport would be radically different come Sweden 4 years later. In fact, the world was a completely different place, and through the medium of the European Championships, that will become obvious in tomorrow's film when we discuss Euro 92, the wildcard Euros.